November 21st, 1944. The Hurtgen Forest. Private First Class Daniel Carney pressed his back against a shattered oak, its bark peeled away by shrapnel like skin from a burn victim. The forest floor was a carpet of mud and pine needles, soaked black with rain that hadn't stopped for 3 days. Every breath tasted like copper and wet earth. His rifle, an M1 Garand, felt heavier than it had that morning, though he knew that was impossible. Weight didn't change. Only the arms carrying it did. The Hurtgen wasn't like the forests back in Oregon. Those had been alive birdsong, wind through Douglas firs, the crack of branches under deer hooves. This place was a cathedral of death. The trees here stood like skeletal witnesses, their tops blown away by artillery, their trunks splintered into jagged teeth. When the wind moved through them, it didn't whistle. It moaned. Daniel's squad had been 12 men that morning. Now they are 7. Corporal Hayes was dead, caught a German MG-42 burst across his chest while crossing a firebreak. Benson and Rodriguez were missing, last seen diving into a crater when mortars started dropping. The rest were scattered somewhere in the gray maze of tree trunks and smoke, following Lieutenant Marsh's orders to push east toward a farm road that probably didn't exist anymore. Daniel's hands were shaking. Not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from exhaustion. They'd been moving for 16 hours with maybe 20 minutes of rest, and his body was starting to forget how to be still. His fingers trembled against the rifle stock. His jaw clenched and unclenched on its own. Somewhere behind his eyes, a headache pulsed in rhythm with distant artillery. A voice hissed from his left. "Carney, do you see anything?" It was Miller. Private Eugene Miller from Philadelphia. A former dock worker with hands like catcher's mitts and a voice that could cut through engine noise. Right now he was crouched behind a fallen log 10 yards away, his helmet tilted back, his face streaked with mud that looked like war paint. Daniel shook his head. "Nothing. You?" "Jack shit." The forest swallowed their words. Everything here felt muffled, compressed, as if the air itself was too thick to carry sound properly. Even the explosions in the distance seemed dulled, like someone had wrapped the entire war in wet wool. Daniel's stomach twisted. He hadn't eaten since dawn half a tin of ham and lima beans that tasted like salted cardboard. His canteen was nearly empty. His feet were numb inside boots that had been wet so long he'd forgotten what dry socks felt like. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was the silence. In combat, silence was never good. Silence meant the enemy was close. Silence meant someone was waiting. Daniel scanned the tree line ahead. Shadows pooled between the trunks like spilled ink. 50 yards out, maybe less. A curtain of fog hung motionless, turning the forest into a stage set where the backdrop kept shifting. He couldn't see more than 30 yards in any direction. His thumb found the safety on his rifle. Still off. Good. Miller was moving now, low and careful, using the log as cover. Daniel watched him for a moment, then pushed off the oak and followed, staying bent at the waist, his boots making soft sucking sounds in the mud. They moved like that for maybe 5 minutes, darting between trees, pausing, listening, moving again. The rest of the squad was somewhere ahead, but Daniel had lost track of them in the chaos of the last firefight. All he knew was that Lieutenant Marsh had screamed something about regrouping near a stone farmhouse, and then the world had turned into smoke and noise and blood. Now there was only this: trees, fog, silence, and then a sound. Daniel froze. It was faint, a wet, rhythmic noise, like someone trying to breathe through water. Miller heard it too. His head snapped toward the sound, his rifle coming up in one smooth motion. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears. He crept forward, one step at a time, his finger resting on the trigger guard. The sound was coming from somewhere to his right, maybe 20 yards off, hidden behind a tangle of fallen branches and torn earth. He moved closer, and then he saw him, a German soldier. Lying on his side in a shallow crater, half buried in mud and leaves, Daniel's first instinct was to raise his rifle, his second was to pull the trigger, but he didn't. Because the German wasn't moving, wasn't reaching for a weapon, wasn't doing anything except bleeding. The man's uniform was soaked dark with blood from the waist down. His face was the color of ash. His eyes were open pale blue, almost gray, and they were staring at Daniel with an expression that wasn't fear or hatred. It was pleading. The German tried to speak. His lips moved, forming words in a language Daniel didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. "Help me." Daniel stood there, frozen, his rifle still pointed at the man's chest. Miller came up beside him, breathing hard. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "He's hit bad." Daniel didn't respond. He was staring at the German's hands. They were clutching his stomach, trying to hold something inside that wasn't supposed to come out. His fingers were slick with blood. "Leave him," Miller said. "Come on, we gotta move." But Daniel didn't move. He couldn't, because something in those pale blue eyes had hooked itself into his chest and wouldn't let go. The German's breathing was getting worse. Each inhale was a wet rattle, like air being pulled through torn fabric. His lips had gone purple at the edges. Daniel lowered his rifle. "What are you doing?" Miller's voice was sharp, urgent. "Carney, what the hell are you doing?" "He's dying," Daniel said quietly. "Yeah, so? He's Jerry. Let him." Daniel looked at Miller. I looked at the hard set of his jaw, the way his knuckles were white around his rifle. Miller wasn't wrong. This was the enemy. This was a man who, an hour ago, might have been the one who killed Hayes. Might have been the one firing that MG-42. Might have been the one who turned Benson and Rodriguez into names on a casualty list. But right now, he was just a kid bleeding out in the mud. Daniel knelt down. "Carney, I'm not leaving him." Miller stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You've got to be kidding me." "I'm not. We don't have time for this. Marsh is gonna—" "Then go find Marsh," Daniel snapped. "I'll catch up." Miller opened his mouth to argue, then shut it. He looked at the German, then back at Daniel. Something shifted in his expression, not agreement, but maybe understanding. Or resignation. "5 minutes," Miller said. "Then I'm dragging you out of here myself." He moved off into the trees, disappearing into the fog like a ghost. Daniel turned back to the German. The man was still watching him. His lips moved again, forming words Daniel couldn't understand. But his eyes, those pale, pleading eyes, said everything. "Don't let me die alone." Daniel set his rifle down and reached for his aid kit. His hands were steadier now. Training took over. He'd done this before, patched up guys in his own squad, tried to keep them alive long enough for a medic to arrive. But those had been Americans, his brothers. This was different. He pulled out a bandage and a morphine syringe. The German's hands were still pressed against his stomach, but Daniel could see the wound now, a ragged tear in the fabric of his tunic, just below the ribs. Shrapnel, maybe, or a rifle round that had tumbled through tissue and bone. "I'm gonna help you," Daniel said, even though he knew the man probably didn't speak English. Just hold on." The German's eyes flickered. Understanding? Gratitude? Daniel couldn't tell. He peeled the man's hands away from the wound. The German gasped a sharp, broken sound, and his body went rigid. Blood welled up immediately, dark and thick. Daniel pressed the bandage down hard. The German screamed. It was a raw animal sound that cut through the muffled silence of the forest like a knife. Daniel flinched, his stomach twisting, but he kept pressure on the wound. He had to. If he let go, the man would bleed out in minutes. "I'm sorry," Daniel muttered. I'm sorry. The German's hand shot out and grabbed Daniel's wrist. His grip was weak, trembling. But there was something in it, desperation maybe, or trust. Daniel looked into his eyes. And for a moment, the war disappeared. There was no forest, no mud, no blood, just two men, one trying to save the other, because that was what you did, because leaving someone to die alone in the dirt wasn't something Daniel could live with. He fumbled for the morphine syringe, tore it open with his teeth, and jabbed it into the German's thigh. The man flinched again, but this time there was no scream, just a slow, shuddering exhale. The morphine would help. Not much, but enough. Daniel kept pressure on the wound, his hands slick with blood. He could hear his own breathing, now short, shallow, too fast. His heart was hammering against his ribs. What was he doing? This was insane. This was suicide. Every second he stayed here was a second closer to getting himself killed. The Germans could be regrouping. The forest was crawling with snipers and machine gun nests. Staying in one place was a death sentence. But he couldn't leave. The German's breathing was starting to even out. The morphine was kicking in. His eyes were still open, still locked on Daniel's face, but the panic in them had dulled. "You're gonna be okay," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "You're gonna make it." The German's lips moved. This time, Daniel heard the word. "Danke." Thank you. Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't know this man's name, didn't know where he was from, or if he had a family waiting for him back in Germany. Didn't know if he was a true believer in Hitler's cause or just a conscript who'd been thrown into the meat grinder like everyone else. But it didn't matter, because at this moment, they were the same. Miller reappeared through the fog like a specter, his face tight with urgency. "We gotta go. Now." Daniel looked up. "He's stabilized. I just need—" "I don't care." Marsh found the farmhouse. "He's rallying the squad. If we don't move, we're getting left behind." Daniel hesitated. The German was still conscious, still watching him. His hand was still gripping Daniel's wrist, though the strength had faded from it. "We can't just leave him," Daniel said. Miller's jaw clenched. "Yes, we can. And we will. He'll die. Probably. But so will we if we don't move." Daniel stared at him. Then he looked back at the German. The man's eyes were pleading again. Not for his life this time, he seemed to understand that was beyond saving, but for something else. "Don't leave me alone." Daniel made a decision. "Help me lift him." Miller blinked. "What?" "Help me lift him. We're taking him with us." "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" "Probably." Miller stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head and laughed a short, bitter sound. "You're gonna get us both killed. You know that?" "Maybe." Miller cursed under his breath, but he slung his rifle over his shoulder and moved to the German's other side. Together, they hoisted the man up. He groaned a low, guttural sound, but he didn't scream. The morphine was doing its job. Daniel looped the German's arm over his shoulder. The man was lighter than he expected, all sinew and bone. His uniform stank of mud and blood and cordite. "Move," Miller grunted. They started walking. It was slow going. Every step sent jolts of pain through the German's body, and he made small, involuntary sounds, gasps, whimpers, sharp intakes of breath. Daniel gritted his teeth and kept moving. The forest seemed to close in around them. The fog thickened. The trees loomed like sentinels. Somewhere, in the distance, artillery rumbled a low, continuous thunder that never quite stopped. Daniel's legs burned, his shoulders ached. The German's weight pressed down on him like a physical burden, but he didn't let go. Miller was cursing steadily under his breath, a stream of profanity that would have made a drill sergeant proud. But he didn't stop moving either. They reached a clearing. The farmhouse was there, or what was left of it. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The roof had caved in. But it was a shelter. And shelter was something. Lieutenant Marsh was standing near the entrance, his helmet cocked back, his face smeared with soot. He saw them coming, and his expression shifted from relief to confusion to anger in the span of a heartbeat. "Kearney, what the hell is that?" Daniel didn't answer. He and Miller carried the German into the farmhouse and set him down gently against a wall. Marsh followed them in, his voice rising. "Private, I asked you a question." Daniel straightened, meeting the lieutenant's eyes. "He's wounded, sir. I couldn't leave him." Marsh stared at him. Then in Germany. Then back at Daniel. "You brought an enemy combatant into our position." "Yes, sir." "Do you have any idea how stupid that is?" "Yes, sir." Marsh's jaw worked. He looked like he wanted to hit something, or someone. But then he looked at the German, really looked at him. Saw the pale face. The blood-soaked uniform, the way his chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. Marsh sighed. "Get him stabilized. Then we're moving out." "Yes, sir." Marsh walked away, shaking his head. Miller slumped against the wall, breathing hard. "You're crazy, Kearney. You know that?" Daniel didn't argue. He knelt beside the German and checked the bandage. It was holding, but barely. The man needed a real medic, a hospital, surgery, things he wasn't going to get. The German's eyes found him again. This time, there was something different in them. Not pleading, not fear. Gratitude. The man's lips moved. He said something in German, soft, halting, barely audible. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. "Thank you for not leaving me." The farmhouse smelled like death and old stone. The rest of the squad was huddled inside, 6 men total now, not counting the German. They sat in corners, against walls, anywhere they could find a patch of floor that wasn't covered in rubble or spent shell casings. No one spoke. They were too tired, too hollow. The kind of tired that went deeper than muscle and bone, all the way down into the marrow. Daniel sat beside the German, his back against the cold stone wall. The morphine had done its job. The man had slipped into a half-conscious state, his breathing shallow but steady. For now. Miller was across the room, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. He hadn't said a word since they'd arrived, but Daniel could feel the weight of his judgment anyway. Lieutenant Marsh was near the door, speaking in low tones with Sergeant Bowman, the only NCO left in the squad. They kept glancing at the German, at Daniel, planning something. Daniel didn't care. He was past caring about protocol, past caring about what made sense. All he knew was that he'd made a choice, and he was going to see it through. The German stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a weak cough. Daniel reached for his canteen and held it to the man's lips. "Easy." Small sips. The German drank. Water dribbled down his chin, mixing with the mud and blood caked there. When he was done, his eyes focused on Daniel's face. "American," he said. His English was broken, heavily accented, but understandable. Daniel nodded. "Yeah. You save me. I'm trying." The German's lips twitched. It might have been a smile, or a grimace. Hard to tell. "Why?" he asked. Daniel didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he had too many answers, all tangled up in a knot he couldn't untie. Because it was the right thing to do. Because leaving someone to die alone felt wrong. Because somewhere, in some farmhouse or foxhole or bombed-out ruin on the other side of the line, there might be a German soldier doing the same thing for an American. Because the war had already taken too much, and Daniel wasn't going to let it take this too. "I don't know," he said finally. The German studied him for a moment. Then he nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "My name," he said, "is Klaus. Daniel." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, the artillery had stopped. The forest was quiet again, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that made your skin crawl. Klaus closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. Daniel thought he'd fallen asleep, but then Klaus spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have, brother, in Hamburg." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "He is, like me, soldier, maybe dead now. I do not know." Klaus opened his eyes again. They were wet. "I want to see him. One more time." Daniel's throat tightened. He thought about his own family, his mother in Oregon, his younger sister who'd written him letters every week until the mail stopped coming. He thought about how much he wanted to see them again, how much he wanted to go home. "You will," Daniel said, though he didn't believe it. Klaus smiled. This time, it was definitely a smile. "You lie," he said. "But, thank you." Across the room, Marsh stood up. He crossed to where Daniel was sitting and crouched down, his eyes hard. "We're moving out in 10 minutes, he said quietly. We can't take him with us. Daniel's jaw tightened. Sir, that's an order, Private. When we leave, he stays. He'll die. Probably. But that's not our problem. Daniel stared at him. He's a human being. He's a German soldier, Marsh said flatly. And we've got a mission. We can't afford dead weight. He's not dead weight. He's the enemy. Carney. And if you don't get that through your skull, you're gonna get yourself killed. Or worse, you're gonna get one of us killed. Marsh stood up and walked away. Daniel looked down at Klaus. The German was watching him, his expression unreadable. You must go, Klaus said. No. Yes. Your officer, he is right. You cannot stay. I'm not leaving you. Klaus reached out and gripped Daniel's wrist the same way he had in the crater. His grip was weaker now, but the meaning was the same. You saved me, Klaus said. That is enough. Tears blurred Daniel's vision. He blinked them away, angry at himself for the weakness. It's not enough, he said. Klaus smiled again. It is. They left at dawn. The squad moved out in single file, slipping through the fog like shadows. Daniel was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, looking back at Klaus. The German was propped up against the wall where Daniel had left him, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow. Daniel had given him the last of his morphine, the last of his water, a blanket from his pack. It wouldn't save him, but maybe it would make the end easier. Carney! Miller's voice, sharp and urgent. Move! Daniel hesitated. Then he stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind him. The squad moved east, toward the sound of distant engines, toward the next objective, the next fight. Daniel didn't look back, but he carried Klaus with him anyway. 3 days later, the war pushed on. The Hurtgen forest gave way to open fields, then to shattered towns, then to rivers choked with bodies. Daniel moved through it all like a ghost, his rifle in his hands, his mind somewhere else. He thought about Klaus every night, wondered if he'd died alone in that farmhouse, or if maybe, just maybe, someone had found him. A German patrol, a medic, anyone. He knew the answer, but he didn't want to believe it. Miller never brought it up. Neither did Marsh. The rest of the squad didn't even know what had happened. They'd been too busy trying to stay alive to notice one more casualty. But Daniel noticed. He noticed the weight of it every time he closed his eyes. Every time he heard someone coughing in the dark. Every time he saw a wounded man left behind because there wasn't time, there wasn't room, there wasn't anything left to give. The war didn't care about Klaus, didn't care about Daniel. I didn't care about any of them, but Daniel cared. And that was the difference. May 7, 1945. The war in Europe ended. Daniel was in a field hospital when he heard the news. He'd taken shrapnel to the leg 2 days earlier, nothing serious, but enough to get him pulled off the line. When the announcement came, the other soldiers cheered. They hugged each other, cried, laughed. Some of them got drunk on whatever alcohol they could scavenge. Daniel sat on his cot and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Klaus. He thought about all the men he'd tried to save and couldn't, all the men he'd left behind because he had no choice. He thought about the line between enemy and human and how thin it really was. And he thought about the fact that, in the end, the only thing that mattered wasn't who won or who lost. It was whether you could look at yourself in the mirror and recognize the person staring back. Daniel could, because on a cold day in November, in a forest that swallowed sound, he'd made a choice. He'd refused to leave a wounded enemy behind. And no matter what the war had taken from him, it couldn't take that.